Anlatırım. Evet. Now, moving on. Our next guest. He teaches environmentally sustainable urbanism and engineering. That is correct. He will present compelling work done internationally to understand the human global impact on the planet. He will also talk about about his work he's undertaking to address these global issues at a local level. Wow, you are fast. I haven't finished yet. You're fast. Please welcome Human Planetary Impact, the Glocal Perspective, Alen Amirkhanian.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. This is a very serious Pecha Kucha. And mine is probably going to be the most serious talk of them all. Okay, sorry. When I titled this talk, I called it Human Planetary Impact, the Glocal Perspective, which is global and local together. And I thought I was being very creative, but when I Googled it, it turns out this is a term that is very commonly used in the field. So at least I have the intuition, as someone pointed out. What I want to do is quickly go over a very broad perspective of what's happening globally about human growth and human impact on the planet. And then come down to the local level and see if we can think globally and act locally. So there's 4 elements to a problem we have created. First, okay, so we're growing in population, we're becoming wealthier over long term, and at the same time, we're living longer. And this chart, for instance, shows in 1800, I probably would have been dead by now. Most of you would have been also dead by now. And we have just simply succeeded in many of the tasks that we undertook as human beings. But this has come at a cost. The formula is very simple. We take resources from this planet, transform it into some useful things like food and heating and water and transport, and return it to the system as waste, what we call as waste. But of course, nature doesn't have waste. And some of the ways in which this impact has been measured, one of the ways is ecological footprint. And if you look at ecological footprint, which is the amount of resources human beings use and return to nature as waste, development is very interlinked with ecological footprint. And some of the specific impacts, climate change, ocean acidification, impacting the nitrogen cycle, loss of biodiversity, these are the major impacts human beings have had on the planet. And if you just look at the carbon emissions over the past 200 years, after the Second World War, we've seen an explosion of carbon dioxide emissions. And this is very closely linked with climate change, as we'll see later on. And so for about 3% per year population growth, we've had 7-8% growth in carbon dioxide emissions. And that's only starting because China is just starting its activities in that respect. And we see a very close correlation between temperature rises and the carbon dioxide emissions. And carbon dioxide emissions have 2 impacts. One is global warming, climate change, and the other one is making the oceans more acidic. Because oceans, turns out, they absorb carbon dioxide. And when they absorb it, they become more acidic. The way we've impacted the nitrogen cycle, and one of the big red arrow things you saw coming off of that chart was impacting the nitrogen cycle, and this leads to this kind of phenomenon called eutrophication, which is basically makes water bodies dead, and for a complex process that you can ask me later about. Now, loss of biodiversity is probably the biggest impacts human beings have had on the planet. Pre-industrial loss of biodiversity was probably about 1 species per million per year. Now we are at about 100 species per million per year. And that's basically anthropogenic. That's caused by human beings. And cities and buildings have had a big role in all of this. Cities occupy up to 2% of the Earth area, but house 50% of the population. It's a very efficient solution in terms of housing people. But at the same time, we've created these human systems that have become parasitic on this ecological system. Ecology has biochemical cycles, it has biospheres, it has ecosystems, and we have buildings, neighborhoods, cities, and so far up to now, we haven't really figured out how that becomes consistent with the ecological system. Now, to kind of systematize our thinking about the impact of human beings on how we can think about green urbanism, there are 10 components that I think are important. And when we specifically focus on the question of biodiversity, these elements become important. How we treat waste, how we treat water, how we understand our green areas and how connected they are. So one thing we're going to do this summer in Yerevan is, along with the United Nations University in Japan, we're pilot testing local biodiversity strategy and planning process, and these are the kinds of activities we're going to do. For instance, when we focus on the issue of water, this is fantastic work done in Portland, Oregon, where we look at how water actually flows, what the water cycle is in the city, for instance. And what they've done is to see how water, for instance, rainwater, when it comes, about none of it goes underground, whereas in natural setting, 50% would go underground. And almost 30% is runoff here in the natural setting, whereas in the city, the water runoff is about 90% water runoff of rainwater. So this is a disruption of the water cycle, for instance, that human beings cause when they build cities. And so what we're going to do is take Yerevan, and there are major water elements in Yerevan. There's a gorge there's a river going through, the Hrazdan Gorge, and there's a Getar that, which is a pretty fast-flowing body of water, which recently was taken underground to build roads. And in my opinion, that was a disaster, and we see some of the results of that when we see extra flooding when rains come. And so we're going to look at options like this is a South Korean example where they took this concrete waterway and they actually tore it up and they built this natural waterway which enhances biodiversity at the same time. So we're going to look at the different elements that impact biodiversity, including this, the natural waterways. Istanbul, of course, you're faced with a city that's grown from the 1980s of 2.5 million to about 14 million. You have huge issues you need to deal with. Clearly, you understand this is your city. Building the third bridge across is going to hugely impact these areas in terms of biodiversity. And these are challenges that I'm not envious of you having, because these are major, major decisions you need to make. And I can't wait for summer. Thank you.
Merci, merci, monsieur. Thank you very much. Now, the questions. Yes. Can we have the mic, please? Yeah. Yes, our enthusiastic friend.
What can be better? A beautiful lady running with a microphone to you, right? Anyways, thank you for the presentation. Monsieur Array, you are becoming bilingual these days. I assume you have 4 or 5 languages. I hope you have. Anyways, getting back to your presentation, I come from Washington, where there is a lot of professional presentations, and I think that this presentation was a little too specific about general stuff, and I was expecting something else. But at the end, you actually met my expectation on the Yerevan and Istanbul thing. Yeah. Question here. Yeah. Can environment become a ground for cooperation between Armenians and Turks?
It clearly can. I mean, environmental issues are cross-border issues. Birds migrating don't understand political boundaries. Waters, of course, has become regulated through international conventions and so on and so forth. But clearly, biological systems could care less about human issues and human systems. So I think there's an opportune moment to think about how environmental issues can forge alliances And a lot of Turkish and Armenian youth, for instance, when they go on environmental workshops or conferences, they have much more in common with each other than, let's say, an Armenian and an American youth might have in terms of environmental issues. Because it's the same part of the world, it's the same region, same kind of issues, kind of economic, political systems are more or less the same. I mean, in terms of the informal culture of how things get done. There certainly is a lot of room. Now, how that gets organized is a whole different matter, and that's probably an area we should think more about. And I'm sure there will be a lot of biologists, a lot of people who are interested in different species of animals who would love to cooperate with Turkish colleagues, because that animal that kind of nests in near Yerevan flies over to eastern Turkey, and so they want to have a lot of information going back and forth, certainly.
One more question?
No more questions.
No? Well then, thank you very much. Mr. Alen Amirkhanian, thank you very much.